With me now is Jonathan Panikoff, Director of the Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. He's also a former U.S. intelligence officer. Good morning. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to ask you, first of all, about the latest developments, Israel hitting the Fordo nuclear site again, as well as striking the notorious Evin prison. What do you make of Israel's actions? How much longer do you think that they will continue to strike Iran?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I think the question is, what are Israel's long-term strategic goals here? Fordo, a follow-up on Fordo of trying to hit something specific makes sense that it's still about the nuclear program and trying to obliterate something else that may have been above ground or close to the surface. On the prison, that's a little bit more difficult. That's a message clearly to the regime itself. And Israel's willingness to have regime change seems to be a bit of mission creep from their original goals to take out Iran's nuclear program and to take out its ballistic missile capabilities significantly. I think that's going to be the question here, is whether or not Israel decides that it can keep pressing its advantage. My indications seem to be that it is going to try, unless it's restrained by the U.S. or convinced by the U.S. to halt. But right now, this is going to continue for at least a little longer.
A little longer. Do you think Israel, behind the scenes, is pressuring or pushing Donald Trump to stay involved, especially now that we're hearing from the president? It seems a warming to the idea of regime change, something that even those in his administration over the weekend were denying that they wanted.
I think the Israelis have actually been quite careful about how they've been engaging President Trump and how they've been pushing, and I expect that to continue. Even with Fordo and the bombing that we saw over the weekend, they did keep raising the possibility, but they were quite calculated in not pushing him so hard. They thought it was important that the president come to the decision and conclusion by himself. I think that the challenge now is with what President Trump put out on Truth Social. As you said, it's been a complete contradiction of really where many in his administration were just yesterday morning. I think Israel certainly favors a regime change. I think President Trump may be trying to do this for additional leverage. I think at the end of the day, he really would like to get back to some sort of diplomacy, some sort of deal. But I think that's hard to imagine starting in a meaningful way until Iran actually does retaliate, whatever course of action they choose to take.
And is everything up to the supreme leader of Iran, who I understand is in hiding with most of his communications cut off?
Ultimately, it would be, and certainly that may have been a challenge, that there seemed to be a real openness from President Trump to send Vice President Vance, to send Steve Witkoff, his chief negotiator with Iran, to engage with the Iranians via Turkey before the strikes happened. There was frustration on the U.S. side that there wasn't a response because, as you said, the supreme leader has been largely cut off from communications and he hasn't been reachable. I think the same is still going to be true now. I think the U.S. fundamentally would welcome a diplomatic effort, but the supreme leader is going to have to make that final decision about whether or not Iran is allowed to engage with the U.S. Ultimately, even Steve Witkoff's direct communications with Arachi, the Iranian foreign minister, are not going to be sufficient to bring people back to the table without Ayatollah Khamenei's permission.
I want to ask you lastly about the Strait of Hormuz, which is another, I guess, option for Iran. If they close it, it is an international waterway, but doesn't it also seem a bit suicidal for Iran to do that? Where do you see this strait playing into how things move forward?
Iran has a number of options in terms of how it's going to retaliate, and the intensity is going to define whether or not this situation escalates into a broader conflict or whether or not it remains contained and you have a chance for a diplomatic off-ramp. The Strait of Hormuz would certainly be an intense retaliation. It's harder to close than folks think. It's about 30 miles wide at its narrowest point. You probably could mine it and have a number of ballistic missiles and other capabilities the Iranians could set up. That blockade could be broken. But look, as you said, a fifth of oil flows through the straits every day, about a quarter of liquefied natural gas. So this would be a big issue for the entire world, especially for Asia, which gets a lot of energy going through there from the Saudis, from the Qataris, and from the Iranians. At the end of the day, this could also be a play from Iran itself to try to cajole China, which gets a lot of black market oil from Iran that goes through the straits, to get China to try to pressure the U.S. We'll see if they actually take that step, but it would certainly be escalatory.
Jonathan Panikoff is the director of the Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Middle East program. He's also a former U.S. intelligence officer. Thank you so much for your time with us today.